Hey guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Satanic Panic video. And this time I'm going to be looking at this, Dungeons & Dragons Witchcraft, Suicide and Violence, which is a winning title if ever I heard one. Now, two things before I go any further. Firstly, this is going to try and be a shorter video than usual. The last couple of Satanic Panic videos I did ran to about half an hour, because I've got a mouth on me if ever I got one, because I can talk for ages. But that's a bit long and was getting a bit waffly. And the reason I'm going to be a lot shorter on this one is because there's actually a lot less to cover. While the booklet itself is 44 pages long, only about 4 of those pages are relevant that we'll go over. The rest are page citations and quotes from the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, while I've got digital copies of them sitting open, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and I could go look these up, there's actually no point, because they are all cut off misquotes. So you look up the page reference and the Dungeon Master's Guide will be saying you shouldn't let your players do these horrible things. And this booklet will just list the horrible things and cut off the don't let your players part. They just misquote everything, they just cut it all off to make this look worse. So you can download this booklet yourselves, you can look all those references up if you really want, but just take it from me, I've looked up the majority of them, and it's just a matter of they are misquoting stuff to make it sound bad. So I'm going to ignore all of those pages. The second point is this isn't really the booklet I actually wanted to cover. Now, this is from Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, Pat Pulling's organisation that she set up after the death of her son, which we will go into further because it's mentioned in here. But this booklet was just talking about it in general, because the booklet I would have really liked to have looked at was the one she distributed to police forces, which was how to detect if there's satanic influence in your prisoners and questions to ask, and that kind of thing. How to work out if the person you've arrested is being influenced by Dungeons & Dragons and fancy role-playing games. Now, that would be absolutely fascinating to look through, but unfortunately, I cannot find a digital copy of it anywhere. So if you have a copy or you know where to find one, please get in touch. I would love to look through that. Even if I didn't make a video about it, I'd love to have a look through it for my own personal jollies. Now, anyway, onto the booklet itself. So, first of all, I've got to criticize the graphic design. This is horrible. I know this is a bad scan of a water-damaged copy which is 40 years old, but the dragon on the top of the page here is just horrible. But the layout is even worse. Now, Dungeons & Dragons, Witchcraft, Suicide and Violence, as the title sort of breaking it up, we've got the names of the authors, Mary Dempsey, Pat Dempsey and Pat A. Pulling, laid out terribly. Why is Pat Dempsey's name overlapping the box? Mary Dempsey is likewise. And the educators, librarians, pastors, police, parents at the bottom. Just their graphic design sucks. It's terrible. The more I play D&D, the more I want to get away from this world. Now, they seem to think that's our winning thing to start off with. But to me, it really says how much this world sucks. We should be improving this world and not making fantasy games worse. Make life better for people so they want to spend more time in it instead of escapism being their only outlet. Inside we've got a contents page listing the main sections. Suicides, banning D&D, statements, religion defined, spell preparation, D&D versus witchcraft, occult, blood and human sacrifice, religious theme, and negativism. Well, I have to say, most of these, as I said, are quotes, but we'll flick through them. Introduction. This pamphlet was prepared specifically to show the negative aspects and direction of the D&D books. With 6,500 teens committing suicide and over 50,000 attempts every year, we cannot afford to overlook a game that teaches witchcraft, Satan worship, and cult-like religion, not to mention specific suicide phrases. What we found in this pamphlet can hardly be considered a healthy release for suppressed hostilities, or of educational value. Well, as I've pointed out in past ones, I don't know about healthy release for suppressed hostilities, but I do kind of find my games that way, but I've got no evidence to back that up. But educational value, I used to be really bad at math, and playing Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games has improved that vastly over the years. I was at primary school, so up to the age of 10-ish, so bad that I was getting taken to years lower for them to show that their skills were better than me, because teachers thought that embarrassing me would spur me on to do better. But turns out rolling some dice and killing some orcs was what they needed to do. Because of this intense and emotional involvement in fantasy role-playing, we find young people who are latent schizophrenic pushed easily over and into a real fantasy world where their ethics become situational and their traditional values are eroded. Well, latent schizophrenics should be getting treatment. This is bad mental health, not bad game. We find examples of young people being sucked into a vortex of undesirable real-life behaviour. We find young people stepping easily into their character, becoming one with the same D&D character. We find emotional involvement at high level while playing the game, especially when one's character is killed. Depression often results, sometimes violence, sometimes murder, sometimes suicide, sometimes mental problems. Citation needed. They offer no evidence of any of that. We have now witnessed libraries and educators taking on great liability by allowing the game to become part of the curriculum or program. Who will take the blame for a suicide or mental problems evolving from the game? Who will be liable? Who is willing to lose a son or a daughter? Does it really mean that such to incorporate a game to venerate a private industry like TSR? I don't quite get the layout of that sentence. I think they mean that this is all on the Temple of Commerce, but I'm guessing they wouldn't usually be against that. We find other school systems across the country banning the game due to the D&D philosophy. Pamphlet is condensed, in-depth, researched investigation designed to save educators and librarians hours of research and for them to reach a common-sense decision. Suicides. The below-listed victims of suicide have one commonality. All were heavily involved in Dungeons & Dragons. All deaths were involved weapons. Save one, 3 died on a full moon. All were white males between the ages of 12 to 18. 3 were honour or gifted students. Right. None of the deaths, you can check, all the dates are there, were on full moons. They were pretty much distributed throughout the year. Dallas D. Egbert's suicide was nearer the new moon than the full moon, so they were about as wrong as they can be. All deaths involved weapons. Well, that's surely an argument for restricting weapons. But to go through them. Now, I've talked about some of these before, so I'll try and keep it brief. James Dallas Egbert III. He was a 16-year-old who was sent off to university, a very gifted boy, who was also homosexual. Now, coming out when you're 16 and you've been sent away to an adult environment was so stressful, and he ran away. Now, the investigation thought that perhaps he was involved in an advanced game of Dungeons & Dragons because the investigator read about it happening in the steam tunnels under the university. Turned out not to be true. He just ran away to get away from the pressure. From knowledge we've got, he never played D&D again once he went back to university, and then he committed suicide a year later. Michael P. Dempsey was the son of the police detective we spoke about in the last Satanic Panic video. Basically, he was playing a video game based on Dungeons & Dragons. He wasn't studying as hard, so his parents banned him from the video game and banned him from seeing his friends. He took a gun and he killed himself. Now, that sounds very little to do with Dungeons & Dragons, but his father is convinced it was, and convinced that he smelt hellfire and sulfur after, so a demon must have been in the room which killed his son. Irvin Lee Pulling III, well, that's Pat Pulling's son. Now, she makes some accusations and her story has some holes in it. She claims that he was heavily involved in the game, but she also claims she never knew that he was heavily involved in the game. Her daughter claims that he threatened to kill her, but Patricia Pulling says that her son was peaceful and never threatened anyone, and in the days leading up to his suicide, he killed all the family cats in the garden. So there were very clear signs that there was something going on with him, and he needed help. It's very sad that he didn't get that. Harold T. Collins, well, he didn't commit suicide. He committed autoerotic asphyxiation. He was trying to get a thrill out of it and death by misadventure. I can understand why his parents maybe didn't want that publicised. They wanted to blame it on Dungeons & Dragons. And the last two are linked. They are brothers, a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, Daniel E. Irwin and Stephen R. Irwin. Well, Daniel was he was up for a crime. He'd committed auto theft and was facing jail time for it. And him and his brother went away and committed suicide. His little brother didn't want to live without him, that kind of thing. And it's tragic and it's terrible, but again, its links to Dungeons & Dragons are absolutely minute. The deaths above do not reflect all suicides, deaths and attempted suicides due to Dungeons & Dragons. Well, from what we can see, those have only a very oblique connection. They played Dungeons & Dragons. None of the suicides themselves directly connect to it. Banning D&D. We've got a page here which lists a lot of schools which are banning D&D. I don't know what that proves, except perhaps pressure. Well, these schools are banning it, so why aren't you? Peer pressure, I don't think is a good reason for anything. Statements. Well, we've got stuff here. John Eric Holmes, editor of the Basic Rulebook for Dungeons & Dragons and associated with ESR. Shouting the Dungeons & Dragons challenge, my players rush into the fray with their magic warhammers before getting an answer. Their fantasy selves indulge in murder, pillage, arson, and rape. See page 9 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 31. So is it page 9 or page 31? I couldn't find any mention of rape in that context in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And this, from what I've read up, is more about John Eric Holmes and his group's style of play. Apparently they did go in for that, where they were far more violent. We've got Dr. Thomas Radecki, MD psychiatrist at the University of Illinois School of Medicine, that every Dungeons & Dragons game he has seen features a theme of armed violence in role-playing situations. Well, most role-playing games actually do. So that's not a misquote. I'm completely fine with that. Most war films involve guns. Most cop films involve guns. It means nothing. Margaret Bosek, Arlington, Virginia School Board. Studies I have made of the game showed the negative effects outweighed any benefits. I have enough information on my own that I can confidently say I don't want it in the schools. Somebody's opinion, there's no backing up of that research. Michael Roop, murder defendant. I became so fascinated with the game Dungeons & Dragons, I began to lose touch with reality. Now, I've seen this numerous times that people in prison will blame it on the game, but they blame their crimes on all sorts of things to try and alleviate their responsibility and get a lesser sentence. It's kind of what people in jail do. Maria Piers, author of Gift of Play, states, any 4-year-old who slays his baby brother in fantasy has my blessing, but if he pinches baby brother, that is where the line has got to be drawn. What? Deborah Fulhammer, sister of Harold T. Collins. He played the game with them, but we stopped when he walked about the house in his evil character, and he became hostile if we joked about D&D. He told us if we'd not stop joking, he would call down a bolt of lightning to kill us. To which they said, go ahead. If I make a promise to do something impossible, then call me on it. Dr. Gary North, our old favourite, author of None Dare Call It Witchcraft, states these games are the most magnificently packaged, most profitably marketed, most thoroughly researched introduction to the occult in man's recorded history. Everybody's favourite quote in these things. Now, I've not really talked about Dr. Gary North, I don't think, in past videos. He is an economist. So he is probably actually praising Dungeons and Dragons. No, he's not. I'm lying there. He is against Dungeons and Dragons, but he's talking about it from an economic point of view, not a psychological point of view. He's not talking about it apart from these games make money from something he considers bad. There appears to be federal grants that are financing the introduction of these games into the local school systems. Well, where? I would like funding. I'd be happy for that. John Tucker, Professor of Psychology, Richmond, Virginia. In Dungeons & Dragons, you are taking the abnormal and making it normal. People need to deal with their emotions, but I think people need to deal with the good ways to overcome problems, good ways to express themselves, good ways to communicate, not necessarily build and deal with evil ways to deal with them. Well, I would say that Dungeons & Dragons is a healthy way to deal with violence. Instead of turning around and smacking somebody around the face, you're going out and you're killing some fantasy orcs, some imaginary monsters, you're wasting. You're getting your hostile feelings out and getting that feel of release from victory and success. That's not a bad thing. Robert Lander, attorney. I've thoroughly researched this game for years, and I'm convinced that the players of Dungeons & Dragons at the advanced levels are adversely affected emotionally, psychologically, and physically. Though the game is fun and produces some positive educational rewards, these are outweighed by the adverse effects brought on by the game. Well, I'm unsure of any of those except physically. Now, I'm sure I've packed on the pounds over the year, eating potato chips and sweeties and drinking fizzy juice while playing D&D, but I can't think of anything else that it's done. I haven't mutated because of the pure evil of the game or anything like that. I've just been eating junk food. Kelly Jean Poppleton, deceased. I like playing Dungeons & Dragons while I'm stoned because it's a head trip. When I'm high and playing, I can really get into the game. I can almost see the orcas coming after me and a spell being cast on me. It's so realistic, I began to feel like a medieval warrior in a cold, damp dungeon fighting for power, gold and glory. It might get a little carried away at times, but I finally come back to earth. Note, Kelly was slain 2 days after the statement involved in drugs. Nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. From my understanding, a drug dealer was being investigated and thought she was the narc who was going to the police, so killed her. What that's got to do with D&D, I don't know. Their deceased really leads you to feel that this person's died something to do with D&D. I think they're heavily biasing it. Continuing, then we're on to religion. Talking about witchcraft as a religion. Yeah, sure. It's as made up as any of the others, so witchcraft is a religion. I'm not arguing with you. Supreme Court has ruled that religion is not to be taught in schools. So they are arguing that Dungeons & Dragons is witchcraft, so shouldn't be taught in schools. Well, first of all, I don't think Dungeons & Dragons is taught in schools, and secondly, Dungeons & Dragons isn't witchcraft. And then we're on to the quotes. So we've got spell preparation, as I said, there's big quotes, and with page references, pages and pages of these, you know, D&D versus Witchcraft Occult, talking about the cacodemon, threat of pain, forced obedience, I shall torture these. They like underlining their stuff. The Necromancers by Peter Haling, page 30 to 31. I don't know whether that's an old D&D book. It's talking about necromancy and that. I don't see what connection it has at all. But we carry on through these pages, as I said. Lots of page references, lots of quotes, all of them taken way out of context. Special center section, blood and human sacrifice. Graveyard desecration, missing children, Satan worship, and witchcraft. And again, references, items needed for the spell, holy water for the protection of evil, and blood for the protection from good. Items need dragon bones or similar tokens. Why is dragon bones a bad thing? Because apart from a dead fantasy creature. Carry on. These babies are sacrificed to Tlaloc, after which the priest cook and eat them. Well, I guess it's not wasteful. Lots and lots, pages and pages of these. D&D religious theme. D&D has become a gaming cult. To avid D&Ders have ceaselessly spread the gospel. Taken from the Player's Handbook. You act out the game as this character playing with your God-given abilities. Again, these are misquotes because it's saying, you shouldn't do that. You're not granted these powers by a god. Yep, carrying on, loads and loads of quotes, negative excerpts. As this book is exclusive precinct for the Dungeon Master, you must view any non-player possessing it as something less than worthy of honourable death. Gary Gygax had a bit of a strange sense of humour, but I can kind of get that. Death lies beyond this point I've seen. I think Paranoia has that in it. But we've got loads and loads of quotes, and then we've got a parting note. Our generation has effectively ushered in the teen suicide era. Never before in the history of this world have our teens been bombarded with harm, for negative influences aimed at the delicate, sensitive, easily swayed minds of our children. The healthy growth and development of our children is being hindered by violent fantasy role-playing games, rock music, which directs the children to get high, shoot up, commit suicide, and Satan worship, pornographic literature, violent movies, and lastly, violent videos, which can be found in these things that builds character, integrity, and high ideals. So that's their point, that Dungeons & Dragons is just as bad as your rock and roll music. This is total satanic panic at its absolute height, where it's trying to scare you off the music you're listening to. And then we've got For Information, Right to Bad, non-profit organisation in Richmond. And then additional copies you can write to Pat Dempsey or Pat Pulling. Well, I'm afraid Pat Pulling's deceased, so you wouldn't have any luck doing that. And $1, whoever bought this copy and uploaded it to the Internet Archive. Anyway, as usual, I've whittled on for quite long enough. This booklet, as I said, I really wanted the police one, which guided people. But I thought the information that they're giving in here is so false that I thought it was fairly interesting to go through and have a look at it. But anyway, I think I've whittled on for quite long enough. So thank you very, very much for watching. And as usual, most of all, you look after yourselves. And I'll catch you later. Bye now.